So this is an information webinar for the Transforming Queensland Manufacturing Grants Program. My name's David Kay. I'm one of the project managers on the grants team. So I'll be able to present to you this morning on an overview of the program and also answer any questions that you may have at the end. So I'm expecting the slide deck part of today's webinar to go for around about half an hour, and the rest of the time that we have available will be used to answer the questions that you have. Before we get started, I would like to acknowledge on behalf of the Department of Natural Resources and Mines, Manufacturing and Regional and Rural Development, the traditional custodians of the lands, seas, skies and waterways that we do our business on throughout the state of Queensland and in any other regions of Australia that people may be joining us from. I would like to acknowledge the First Peoples of Queensland and continue to commit to upholding and valuing the collective cultural, spiritual and healing knowledge of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. I pay my respects to elders past and present and acknowledge the stolen generations and those who are still finding their way home. Now, in today's webinar, I will go through a few of the rules, regulations and so forth of the program. We'll talk about what the objectives are from the government's perspective and why this program has been launched. I'll talk about the eligibility criteria, the application and the assessment process, and I'll actually talk a little more about the grant agreement process as well, for those of you who make it all the way through to the end. I'll cover a few practical tips for writing the application and also share a few sources of further information you can be visiting after today. So I will be making frequent mention during the webinar of the applicant guidelines. For those of you who don't have a copy in front of you, I strongly recommend that you have a look at those. It's available via the link on the slide that's in view now. So if you do happen to have them in front of you, every so often I will make reference to specific section numbers and so forth of the guidelines. So it'll be helpful for you to have that in front of you. And also when we get through to the Q&A part of today, I'll probably make mention of specific sections of the guidelines again, depending on the questions. So the Transforming Queensland Manufacturing Grants Program, it is a manufacturing grants program, which means that the eligibility is around being a manufacturer and being in Queensland. The program value is 79.1 million over the next 3 years. So this is round one. So a portion of that money is going to be available in round one, and then we have 5 rounds following this one. So we're talking $12.5 million will be available for grants in this first round. The program objectives include what's up on the screen there, as in pathways for export opportunities, enabling onshoring and reshoring, enhancing manufacturing sovereignty, which is of course closely linked to the first one, encouraging investment, supporting jobs in manufacturing, and addressing ongoing disruptions to supply chains. Also, while we're looking at those objectives, we are going to put a quick poll up, and if you'd just like to tell us where you're joining from today, either within Southeast Queensland, from regional Queensland, or outside of Queensland, if you'd just like to let us know where it is you're joining from, that would be super helpful. There's just purely that information is all that's being collected there. So the reason why I like to go through the objectives of the grant is that these are points that in your grant application you should be coming back to again and again. If you're going to be enabling new export opportunities through the grant project that you have, certainly you should be letting us know that. If it's going to enable reshoring and onshoring, and for the purposes of this grant program, what that means is somebody in Queensland is going to be manufacturing items which are currently manufactured outside of Queensland, or increasing the manufacture of an item in Queensland to replace what's currently being brought in from outside. So that's all about enhancing manufacturing sovereignty as well. And So any investment that you'll be putting into the project, bearing in mind that this is a matched funding grant program. So if you're spending $1 million, for example, on your project, the maximum you can have from us is 500,000. The new jobs that you'll be creating as a result should be in there. And also, if your project is effectively plugging a gap or minimizing disruptions that are currently being experienced through various supply chains, let us know about that as well, because this is why the program has been concepted and introduced. These are the objectives that myself and the grant team will be reporting back on having met. And so when it comes to assessment, people who are meeting the objectives and can state that very clearly are going to have a better chance of being assessed with a higher score. So round one opened on the 5th of February. It closes on the 16th of April at 1 p.m. And I do want to emphasize that 1 p.m. closure date, where it's an electronic system. Once that 1 p.m. time has passed, you will not be able to submit, and we do not accept late submissions. So do be aware you don't have the full day on the 16th of April to finish that submission off. Preferably, you'll have done that by the 15th at the very latest. But yeah, do remember that 1 p.m. closing date and time. So the matched funding is available from $100,000 to $1.5 million per grant. And so bear in mind that regardless of your eligibility of the items, you can only seek that maximum of 1.5 million. The minimum is $100,000. So again, that means your project size is going to need to be $200,000 in order to be an eligible project. So also consider that one. And the $12.5 million funding pool is going to be available equally between projects located in regional Queensland and projects located in southeast Queensland. And this is all dependent not on where your business is necessarily located now, but where your project is going to be located. So if, for example, your business is in Brisbane, but your project is going to be in Wide Bay on a new site, then you'll be in the pool for regional funding, not the pool for southeast Queensland funding. And I will cover this again when we get to assessment, but the way assessment will work is effectively the top ranked projects for southeast Queensland and the top ranked projects for regional Queensland will each be offered funding until that $12.5 million funding pool is exhausted. The time frame that we're looking at, so there'll be roughly 10 weeks from the release of guidelines and the opening of the round until submissions close. Assessment will be starting effectively at about 1:05 on the 16th of April. We'll just be getting straight into eligibility assessments on that afternoon. The award process we're taking, so we're expecting that the assessment process will take around about 16 weeks, so roughly 4 months after that closing date of the 16th of April. So we're looking at mid-August to know what's happened with your application, and after that date, we'll be expecting grant agreements to be signed, projects to be commencing in that time frame. So if you're putting an application together, do remember that you won't be looking at a grant award until the middle of August this year, assuming that we get around about 100 applications. If we get more, we'll let people know that the assessment process may take longer, but we'll certainly be working to get everything finished within that 16-week time frame so that everybody can get their project started and underway. So to be an eligible applicant, and for those of you who do have a copy of the guidelines, this is in section 2.4. There is quite an exhaustive list in that section that goes above and beyond what's here in this slide. But the main points are up on the slide here. So you need to be a Queensland manufacturer with 5 to 200 FTE employees, and you need to have a project site that's located in Queensland. Being a Queensland manufacturer under this program means that you are a manufacturing business, so you earn the majority of your revenues from manufacturing activities, and that you do have some manufacturing in Queensland. You don't need to have all of your manufacturing in Queensland, but you do need to be currently manufacturing in Queensland. in order to be considered eligible, and the number of FTE employees, that $200 maximum rather, is about employees located anywhere. So if you have 100 employees in Queensland and 300 employees around Australia, you won't be considered an eligible applicant. You do need to be a small to medium enterprise to be eligible for the program. You do need to have operated in Queensland for 3 years prior to making your application. And you also need to give us valid quotes for every item where grant funding is being sought. So do bear in mind that you need to attach quotes for each and every item where you're seeking funding. If there is no quote, it won't be considered eligible for funding regardless of what that item is. So you must have those quotes submitted to us when you're submitting that application. You can't submit them later on. There will also be in the application form a number of questions around the business's financial history and financial forecasts, which is why we're looking for those years of operation. And you need to demonstrate that through whatever mechanism, loans, cash in hand, whatever it happens to be, you have the financial capacity to fund the project that you're undertaking, noting that our grant payments are made in arrears. Effectively, when you hit a milestone, we'll release the next payment to you once you've filled in a form to show us that you have met that milestone. But grant payments are made in arrears, so there will be that lag time between some of the costs you'll incur on these projects and receiving the grant payment from us when you've hit that milestone. So do bear in mind that if you have already commenced your project, it won't be considered eligible as well. However, on that note, when you're making an application, you do get the chance to define the project in whichever way you like. So, for example, we've had applicants in the past for other programs where they're building a building, which isn't an eligible expense for our program, and then getting some equipment in. So we would encourage you there to define the project for the purposes of the application as the purchase and installation of the equipment, not the entire build project, if that makes sense. Now, you also do need to be GST registered and have an active ABN, and accepting the terms and conditions of application, which are all listed in the guidelines as well. But I would encourage everybody who's listening in today to have a read all the way through those guidelines, especially section 2.4, as there are a lot more eligibility criteria to cover in order to be considered an eligible applicant. And this is the first thing that is going to be checked on receipt of your application at that closing date and time. Is the team here will be looking through the eligibility criteria to see who's going to move forward to scored assessment. Eligible project costs are effectively quite straightforward for this grant program. Your project can include, as an eligible cost, the purchase of advanced manufacturing equipment, which is covered in section 2.5 of the guidelines, and software to support system integration and use, where you're going to need some software integration to support the equipment being used in your existing manufacturing process, or to set up a brand new process with equipment that you're purchasing under the grant. These are your eligible project costs, and effectively anything that doesn't fall into one of those 2 dot points is not considered an eligible cost within this program. Ineligible costs, so they include effectively everything that isn't part of those eligible costs, but things like your travel and accommodation if you're traveling out to an overseas supplier to inspect equipment before acceptance, that wouldn't be covered as a cost. Anything that you are doing yourself is not considered to be an eligible item. So if you're making the equipment yourself, that's great, but you aren't going to be receiving grant support from this program. You do have to be owning the equipment, so it cannot be leased, hire purchase, or going to be supplied to you via a third party. And in the sense of this, it means not the applicant entity. Research and development is also not eligible. Neither is non-fixed equipment. So if it's a manufacturing device, but it's effectively tracked or otherwise a vehicle to be moved around, it wouldn't be eligible under this program. Contingencies and cost overruns are also not eligible, along with anything to do with repair, maintenance, purchasing or leasing of vehicles. Again, that section 2.6 in the guidelines has a longer list than the one I've just read out here. So do make sure that anything you're putting in to the application is going to be eligible, where you're seeking funding, of course. If it is part of the project, you can pop it in there as part of your project cost listing, but do bear in mind, if it's not eligible for project support, you don't need to be providing things like quotes and so forth. Now, the assessment criteria. So once we've received all the applications and we have completed the eligibility checks and effectively sorted out the eligible applicants from the non-eligible ones, the eligible applications will be passed through to the assessment process. And you can see up on the screen here what the assessment criteria are and the level of weighting that is given to that criteria. So we have 25% for how the project is going to build the capability and capacity of the business to improve its productivity, competitiveness, and increase profitability. There will be questions in the application form that directly address this criteria. And so bear in mind that you need to be answering those in a reasonable level of detail, because this is a fair part of the scoring. And the more information you can provide on how you're going to meet these, the higher your weighted score is going to be there. Criteria 2 is about alignment with those project objectives, and particularly around the export opportunities and the reshoring. So there is a 25% weighting there. The next one at 20% is how it's going to support current manufacturing jobs. So that would be the workforce you currently have, and also creating new high-skilled jobs. So in this criteria, you do want to be answering not just for the new jobs you'll be creating, but if you're intending to upskill, retrain your existing staff as part of the project implementation, you have a chance to talk about that as well, because that will be taken into account. If a job goes from low or medium skilled to high skilled as part of the new equipment, you can absolutely be telling us about that as well. 20% of the weighting is also around your project planning and how well this project fits with the existing strategic direction of your business. So we'll be looking for strategic planning, evidence of your business, the project plan itself, the level of detail that it goes into, and your application form, when you have a look at it, will provide you with hints and tips on the kind of things you would like to include in there, again, to give yourself the best chance of getting the highest possible score you can. And the project demonstrates value for money to local industry and the state. So in effect, the first 4 criteria are about the value for money to you as the applicant business. The 5th question, which will be reflected in the application form, is about the flow on value to local industry. So for example, if you're going to be, hiring new staff as part of that, but also if you're going to be increasing your use of local suppliers or local inputs in your business, or increasing your capability to supply into local projects as a local business, these are the kind of value for money things you can be talking about in that section of the application. When you do get onto completing the application, so it is an electronic form, it's on a system known as Smarty Grants, you can freely save and return to the application form as you're filling it in. This doesn't have to be a one and done process. Do bear in mind that you will not be able to submit the form unless every question marked with a red asterisk has been answered. And in some cases, bear in mind that the asterisk will apply to files to be attached to be uploaded. So for example, your quotes, your business financials, these are things where you do need to be having a file to attach in everything, and any questions marked with a red asterisk do need to have been answered in some way before you actually hit that submit button. Otherwise, the system won't accept your submission. So that's also part of the reason why we like to advise or recommend people that they do submit well and before that closing date and time, because it's not 5 minutes before the closing time is not the time you want to realize that you have a few more forms to attach, because again, once that time's passed, we won't be accepting any late applications there. So do remember that time of 1 p.m. as well as the date of the 16th of April. So yeah, do bear in mind this is a competitive process. Historically, with other similar manufacturing grants of the past, roughly 1 in 4 applications, or 1 in 4 eligible applications, has received an offer of a grant. So assuming you can pass the eligibility, you still will have all of the other applicants to effectively compete against, and the applications get scored against those evaluation criteria as I covered, and then ranked. And it's simply a case of the highest scores will receive an offer of a grant until such time as that round one funding has been exhausted. And those below the line won't be offered a grant. And also, we won't be taking applications from one round into the next. That is something that you can make a decision to do as an applicant, but unsuccessful applications from round one will not automatically be entered into the pool for round two. That will be a separate process that you can choose to undertake or not, but it will be a separate decision to be made, and we won't be making that for you. So make sure you're answering those questions in full and addressing all of those assessment criteria as completely as you can, as well as those program objectives. You need to give us sufficient information to demonstrate that you are an eligible applicant with an eligible project. Where we do have questions about eligibility, we will contact people after the closing date and time for some very specific information. Where the assessors cannot make that determination, you'll be given an opportunity to clarify that. But effectively, you do need to be able to demonstrate to us that you are eligible. Otherwise, we cannot find you to be an eligible applicant or with an eligible project. Note that there is a word limit questions that apply, but you will find that you can come in under that word count. And if the word count is greater than the number of words you've needed to answer, that's fine. Don't feel that you need to fill in the space with anything else. Make sure you give us a good amount of detail on the project and also the expected outcomes of that project. And as I said, make sure you related it back to those program objectives, because these ultimately is the difference between a good score and a high score. And you want to get the highest possible score that you can in order to get that invitation. So we will be asking for a lot of business information, and do remember that all the information we're asking for is directly related to one or more things. So it's going to be related either to your eligibility in some way. So those questions relate back to the eligibility in that section 2.4 of the guidelines, and also section 2.5 for your project items. And the rest of the questions relate to either one or more scored criteria or to that value for money process that will be carried out as well, which is why we'll be asking for financial forecasts and so forth. So make sure you can give us all of that information that's up on the screen there. A word on the ANZIC code. Some of you may not have an ANZIC manufacturing code for one reason or another. That's okay. Not having a manufacturing ANZIC does not make you ineligible. You will be given a chance to let us know how it is that you do derive the majority of your turnover from manufacturing activities, which the eligibility assessment team will be taking into account there. And so before you hit submit, do check you've answered every mandatory question, given us all of those required documents, including any required ownership structure of the business, any trust deed if the business is involved in a trust structure, your strategic plan, your project plan, and the implementation timeline, quotes for every item where you're seeking funding, and your insurance certificates of currency. These are frequent things where if you haven't attached them, you'll get a message saying that you couldn't submit. So these are the things that you need to make sure that you've got in. It's always good practice to check for any typos or unclear sentences. It's great if you can get somebody from outside the business or outside the application process to read it and let you know if something was not particularly clear. Because remember, we won't be talking to applicants about the scored part of the application. We'll only come back to you if the eligibility is unclear. You do not have the facility to resubmit an expanded or extended answer to any of those scored questions. Once that date and time has passed, we'll assess in that side of things, on the scored side of things, we assess only what has been submitted by that due date and time. So the assessment processes I've covered. The first thing we do is assess everything for eligibility, clarifying where necessary. After that, we move to the scoring process and also a due diligence process to ensure that you have the financial capacity necessary to undertake this particular project. If we can't confirm that, then that may make the rest of the application ineligible, regardless of the status of yourself as an entity or the items being eligible. We also need to find that you have that financial capacity to undertake the project as well. So, and then once everything has been scored and ranked, we will be offering funding to the highest ranked going down until such time as that pool has been fully allocated. Depending on the volume of applications received, and we are aware there is a high level of interest in this program, we anticipate that 16-week process of getting everything scored and going through all required internal approvals to have that release and contact people. So even if you do turn out to be ineligible or unsuccessful, you'll also be having that news at the finalization of the assessment process. So everybody will be informed over the same 1 to 2 day period once we've got through the entirety of the assessment process. Now, just moving ahead, so those of you who do go through this and are successful, while this is covered in the guidelines as well, I do like to just point out that we do have an option of you can provide us with a bank guarantee for 20% of the total grant amount. And then we will provide you with an upfront payment of that same 20%. We will hold the bank guarantee against that amount pending delivery of the project. Once your final payment under the grant agreement is made, that bank guarantee will then be released. This is how you need to get into the grant agreement and have an upfront payment. If you're not looking for an upfront payment, then the state will be seeking to take out security over funded items of a certain value or higher, and security will be for a period of 7 years. And that is because 7 years is the minimum we can take security out under that system, which is operated by the Commonwealth Government. We can release early on the expiry of the grant agreements at your request. And also note that if you are not providing us with a bank guarantee or not planning to, you won't be receiving any upfront payments. All payments will be made in arrears for those grant agreements once milestones have been met, all the way up to completion of the project. Now, for those of you who have further questions after today, and we will of course be getting into the question and answer period quite shortly, but you can visit or call one of our manufacturing hubs that are located around the state, and they can assist you both with your application questions and also with any additional eligibility questions that you may have. Now, we do have a phone number up on the screen as well as an email you can send inquiries off to. If it does turn out that the Transforming Queensland Manufacturing Grants Program is not a good fit for you, then the grants finder may have programs listed that will be a better fit for you, for your business and for what it is you're trying to do. Otherwise, this context thing is where you will be going for further information. So that does bring us to the end of the webinar. So I will stop sharing my slides and come back to the actual program now. As soon as I figure out how to do that. Okay, sorry about that, everyone. It looks like the question slide is going to be with us for the rest of the time. I will just jump into the question side of the chat. And if you do have any further questions, do feel free to fire them off to us. So when does the project have to start in order to fit into this? Well, the project can't have commenced before the signing of a grant agreement. So a project would need to be planned to start no sooner than August of this year, and realistically, probably in September or October of this year, to give time for a funding agreement, a grant agreement, to actually have been signed and executed. Will slides be shared? Yes, we'll be sending a link to the slides out to everybody following this session, along with that recording. I do believe I answered the question of our projects that have already commenced eligible. No, they're not. But again, you do have that opportunity there to express the project in a way that best suits what it is you're trying to do and where you're up to with that. So the question about does it align with program objectives for both export and onshoring? You can, exactly, you can be doing either of those two things. You don't have to be doing both. Startups are, no, okay, I see, yep, startups are not eligible for this. Yes, if a manufacturer has greater than 200 FTEs, you're not going to be eligible for this program. And I would definitely recommend the grants finder to see if there are other programs that are more suitable for a business of that larger size. Feedback on applications is offered at the close of the process. So anybody who is successful or unsuccessful is going to be offered feedback on that. It's very much a, if you ask us, we will provide a feedback session for you. They're not offered automatically according to a schedule. You just need to ask. The question about if you're successful, can you apply for further rounds? The short answer is yes to that. The slightly longer answer is there is a lifetime program limit across the 6 rounds of $1.5 million in funding for any individual applicant. So, or a related entity to a successful applicant. So if, for example, you receive a $500,000 grant in round 1, you could be applying for up to $1 million in subsequent rounds to that. Questions on business structure can get a little complex, but effectively the business entity as a whole must be providing or must be generating the majority of their turnover from manufacturing. So it will be considered on that whole of entity process. So the question about whether a services company is able to apply for this grant and be found eligible, it is a case of, again, demonstrating that you are generating the majority of your turnover from manufacturing activity. So if you have services contracts related to items you have manufactured, you can make a case as to why you're meeting that eligibility criteria there. Yes, feedback will be provided to the unsuccessfuls to help with future applications as well. And yes, the question of grants don't allow financial commitment to be made before an application was deemed successful. Is this still the case? It is the case that the project should not have commenced before then, and also that any payments that are made before the execution of a grant agreement are themselves not eligible to receive grant funding. So do be aware of the timelines that I've been talking about today. If we end up looking like we're going to be missing that August timeline, we will be getting in touch with people to let you know. If a business has fewer than 5 employees, again, it would not be eligible for this program. And I would again recommend the grant finder to look at small business programs that can be much more suitable for a business of that size. Anybody who has received grant funding from different programs, that does not affect your eligibility or the amount you can apply for in this particular program. In effect, the slate is wiped clean if you've been receiving funding from other programs in previous years. The TQM grants program is just looking at funding received within this program. Can an application be across multiple years? I'm not 100% sure what that question means, but the project should be delivered within 12 months, or you should provide us with an explanation as to why a project cannot be delivered within 12 months. So, for example, if the equipment won't be delivered for 18 months and the quote reflects that, that is a perfectly acceptable reason as to why your project would take more than 12 months. And we will be seeking outcomes when you're answering those questions about the productivity, export outcomes, and so on. You do not have to be meeting those within 12 months of the project. Those can be multi-year outcomes up to 5 years in advance of the project being completed, and the form will allow you to basically put that in and explain what outcomes you would be meeting in what particular timeline. Standalone ERPs can be applied for where they are going to be meeting those project objectives, but do bear in mind you will be competing against projects that are installing equipment as well and are probably going to be creating superior outcomes. So you can make the argument for the standalone projects, but generally speaking, we're looking for it to be supporting the implementation of new equipment or new manufacturing lines. The time frame for completing the project. So 12 months is not a hard limit. Do be upfront with us because you'll be supplying those quotes upfront about what those delivery timeframes are likely to be, and we'll be looking at that. Does equipment have to be new or can it be used? Equipment should be new manufacturing equipment. If it's being used or ex-lease equipment, it's not going to be eligible under this program. The assessment time is going to be 16 weeks, depending on the number of applications received. And we've got a few repetitive questions there. So the larger group, anybody within a larger group, the FTE count of a larger group is going to be what's considered as part of assessment. So if you're within a 1,000 person business structure and you've got 100 people manufacturing, that's not a small to medium enterprise, that is a large business, and it will be considered as such during the assessment process. So expanding to a new facility, the eligibility of this program is very much focused around manufacturing equipment and the software to support implementation of that. So if you're expanding your facility, new buildings, etc., that is going to be considered ineligible. It may well be outside of the project eligibility, but that is what that's going to be. The minimum project size is going to be 200,000, yes, in the sense that you must have $200,000 of eligible project costs in order to meet that $100,000 minimum for the project. For multinationals, we will be considering again that full structure. So bear in mind, we're looking at that structure as part of the eligibility of that. Having the directors or ownership located overseas is not an exclusion in and of itself, but we will be considering all the eligibility criteria for that. In terms of the jobs thing, we have found that there is little to no contradiction between looking at advanced manufacturing processes and job creation. In the past, we find that manufacturing equipment increases productivity and capacity to such an extent that businesses find themselves putting on extra staff. So we have not found that that is a particular area of contention within our program. Confidentiality. So everybody involved in any assessment process at any point in your application is asked to fill in a confidentiality form, and also to notify us if they feel that they have or may be considered to have a conflict of interest based on anybody involved, not just the business, but the individuals involved in the application. That is all looked at, and that is assessed and reassessed continually throughout the application process to ensure fairness to everybody there. In-kind contributions are not considered. It must be a cash contribution. So machinery and staff wages are not considered as part of a business contribution to a project. It has to be, again, 50-50 funding. Those of you who also either grow things that manufacture or fix things that are manufactured, it is looking at, again, and you will be given the chance to make a written argument as to why your turnover is derived from manufacturing in that application form. So growers are not necessarily excluded, but it's about where your income is coming from and whether or not there's a manufacturing process involved in that. For those of you who have recently received manufacturing grant funding, either from the Made in Queensland Process program or other previous programs, having a project in progress for those programs will not make you ineligible for the Transforming Queensland Manufacturing Grants. The eligibility criteria in there of not having an ongoing project under the TQM program is really there for rounds 2 forward, and to let people know at this point of application that you must have completed one grant agreement completely, as in the agreement has been finalised, before an application can be accepted for the next funding application from you, even if you do have, again, less than 1.5 million in funding. The Gold Coast is considered Southeast Queensland under this project, so it will be any applications from the Gold Coast, and the guidelines have, it's based on your local government area. The guidelines have a list of 7 local government areas which are considered to be Southeast Queensland under this program. And so if you have a look there, you'll be able to see that, and those are repeated again in the application form. So when we talk about value for money, in terms of those of you who might be asking for the full 1.5 million versus $100,000, it's about the outcomes based on the size of the project that are going to be assessed. So there isn't necessarily a weighting towards a higher or a lower value. It's about how the project itself is going to be delivering value based on the funding and what it's going to be achieving. How is the funding spread across regions? So if you are outside of Southeast Queensland, you are effectively competing with everybody outside of Southeast Queensland for that funding. There is no regional breakdown within that. And similarly for Southeast Queensland, there is no breakdown within that for Moreton Bay or for Brisbane or for the Gold Coast. You're effectively put into one of those 2 pools, and you will be competing against other applicants from those particular regions. And again, that's based on the location of your project site. The question around, does equipment assembly or recycling qualify as manufacturing? That is something that you'll need to look at in the ANZIC definitions of what your business is doing, and then let us know that in your application form. So some assembly will indeed count as manufacturing, but it is a bit of it depends on the specifics of that business. So those of you who have multiple projects, just bear in mind that only one project is going to be accepted under this program, because you cannot be completing one project and be receiving a grant agreement for a second one. So this is about making a choice or rolling projects up into a single application, whichever one is going to be more suitable for your business. Yes, so does the grant offer 50% of the total project cost? The grant will offer a maximum of 50% of eligible project costs, bearing in mind that some of your project costs may be ineligible, but you may still talk about them. But we will be offering a maximum of 50% of the total eligible project costs. If you are reducing your number of skilled employees, then bear in mind that in your application, you'll be competing against applicants who may not be doing that, and so you can expect to get a lower score against job creation than those who are. So yes, if you are a subsidiary of a large group, that will not necessarily by itself make you ineligible, but it is the group as a whole that will be tested when we come to looking at those eligibility criteria. Yes, so as a reminder, any projects that have already commenced will not be eligible to receive funding under this. So if, for example, you've already signed a purchasing agreement for the equipment and already paid money, any monies paid would not be considered eligible for refunding or, for contribution under a grant agreement. So do bear that in mind when you're starting the application process. Does Australian ownership and operation receive additional consideration? It's less about does the ownership receive additional consideration, but it's something that you can talk about the advantages of as you see them and within the program definitions in the value for money. What is the value for money that this grant is going to provide beyond your business to the state and to local industry based on how your business operates? That is where you can be hitting the point that being a Queensland-based manufacturer is a benefit over being a more distributed manufacturer if it happened to be that. But again, those of you who are not in that, you're not being excluded on that basis. But it is something that we shall be considering in that value for money section as to what are the knock-on effects for the rest of Queensland of supporting one particular project versus another. Now I'm just flicking between the Q&A and the questions themselves. So can 6 applications, each totaling 1.5 million, be made for each round? So again, we will only be supporting one project per applicant per round until such time as that applicant no longer has a grant agreement they are completing. So we can't stop you from putting in 6 eligible projects for a round, but do bear in mind that a maximum of one of those will be considered for funding. And should you be successful in funding for round 1, you would need to have completed that grant agreement before you can be eligible for future funding. And while timing of future rounds is not yet confirmed, we are expecting roughly 6 monthly round releases. So bear in mind, if you are successful in round 1, it's probably going to be around about round 4 before you can be applying or you can be eligible to receive more funding under the program. So if anyone has any last questions, I'll just wait a couple of minutes for some more of those to come in. And is clean energy, e.g. solar plants, to add to lean manufacturing lines eligible? No, it does have to be manufacturing equipment, not non-manufacturing equipment that supports a manufacturing process. So energy switchovers, you may find that there is other state or federal funding for those sorts of projects, but it's not, you do need to have advanced manufacturing equipment in your eligible equipment list for the Transforming Queensland Manufacturing Grant. So in terms of those evaluation criteria, how strongly is sovereign capability and reducing reliance on impacts being weighted? That is covered in the evaluation criteria 2, which is 25% of the weighting under this program. And where necessary, you can be looking at how that is building up your responses to criteria around your own international competitiveness or around the manufacturing job support, where you're bringing manufacturing work in from overseas. So you can kind of hit that note several times throughout your application. If you are looking to relocate to Queensland, this is not a program that will support that. You must be already manufacturing in Queensland. You must be doing at least some manufacturing in Queensland in order to be eligible. This program is not designed to be funding relocations of businesses. If you do have a very large relocation project, what I would encourage you to do is get in touch with Queensland Treasury through their website, as they have other programs that have more of that relocation outlook versus this one. The leading edge equipment is very much part of the eligibility this time. The criteria are based on what that leading edge equipment allows you and your business to achieve. And so you do need to be telling us how your equipment is leading edge and how it's industry leading and an improvement over what's currently being done. But this is considered as part of the eligibility, whereas the effect of your equipment is what we're looking at in those scored criteria. You can make an argument for analytical equipment. as part of a manufacturing process line, as part of that QA, especially if you are in a high-tech area where the QA is part and parcel of the manufacturing process before something's going to be approved for release to a customer. So again, have a look at that, and again, have a look at those evaluation criteria of what that is letting you do. Yes, so those of you who are startups, if you haven't been in continual operation for 3 years, you won't be eligible for this program. Bearing in mind this is a 3-year program, so you may find yourselves eligible for future rounds, but not this first round. And does the level of leading edge affect the scoring, or is it just yes, no? The level of leading edge will affect the scoring in terms of what that leading edge equipment is allowing you to do in terms of meeting the criteria. If that is helpful, we would encourage you to let us know that you're meeting these criteria through the leading edge nature of your equipment. That it is leading edge or that it is advanced manufacturing equipment affects the eligibility of that particular piece of equipment. However, tying that forward into the score criteria is certainly something that I would recommend you do wherever possible. And don't just treat that as a yes, no. For those still here, I'm still online to answer more questions, anything that comes up. But again, we do have the manufacturing hubs who are here to contact you, and the phone number that was up on the screen a little earlier that you can call if you have any questions, or email the email that was there. And again, a copy of this slide deck will be sent out to everyone after the webinar wraps up. So expect to get it either this afternoon or tomorrow. And it will have those contact details there if you didn't get a chance to note them down while I had the slide up. Now, I notice we're technically 10 minutes over time, so thanks to those of you who've stayed on and listened to my answers to the questions. I'll stay on for a couple of more minutes to allow any more questions to come in, but obviously those of you who wish to leave, you're more than welcome to do so. And thanks very much for your attendance at the webinar today, and best of luck with either your application or with whatever program you do choose to go forward with your project on for support. Yes, will grants be given to applicants who've received federal government grants for the same project? The answer there is no. You must not be receiving other funding for the same project that you apply to Transforming Queensland Manufacturing grants under. But again, bear in mind that you have the opportunity at that point of application to define the project however you wish. So, for example, if you were receiving funding for a building and were seeking funding for equipment to go into that building from us, then the project under Transforming Queensland Manufacturing grants is just the installation of equipment into that building. And the fact that you've received grants for that building is not relevant, because you can express that project to just stick to what's eligible there. Yes, we will be looking at putting a recording of this webinar up on as a YouTube video, and we'll be sending the link around to everybody as soon as that goes up. But we should be able to get the slides out to you first, with the recording to follow once we've got the technical aspects of doing that confirmed at our end. Yeah, I'll give it a couple of more minutes just in case there's any questions from those of you who are still with us. But again, thanks, and I do hope you have enjoyed the webinar, and I appreciate the thank yous coming up on the screen at the moment from everybody. And as I say, if any questions do occur to you after today, there will be contacts for you to get in touch with us, where our regional staff in the hubs aren't able to answer a question. They will refer it through to us. Do bear in mind, some things we cannot confirm ahead of the application submission, but because effectively the eligibility, for example, is confirmed through that eligibility assessment, but where it's black and white and you either do or do not fit into the eligibility, we're more than happy to answer those questions up front, of course, to save any pain later. But yes, we will answer as many questions as we possibly can between now and the 16th of April at 1 p.m. Yeah, the welding robots question is a very good one. I think realistically, a robotic welder is currently leading edge within the manufacturing industry, and that's the best way to talk about it, as well as looking at what the implementation of those robotic welders within your business is going to allow you to achieve in terms of both the scored criteria and of course those program objectives there. So it doesn't have to be, especially when your welding robot is effectively a universal robot arm. We understand that there are more that they are universal robot arms, but they are still the industry leading aspect there, and it's about what you're going to do with that industry leading robotic welder in this case, that is going to make your application stand out. We will close the meeting there, and thanks to those of you who have stayed on for so long. I hope you have a great rest of the day, and thank you for your attendance at the webinar.